Okay, we're live. People can talk. We don't have to be quiet.
And I see we have 5 audience members online already.
Great. So should we get started?
Absolutely. So, morning to everybody in whichever time zone they're in. We are kicking off here part 2 of our 4-part series on scale and online learning. And a big thank you to everyone who's joining us today. We seem to have the technology working this week. There's a little bit of echoes and feedback, but it all seems to be working okay. So let's charge on and keep our fingers crossed. I'm Carl from P2PU, and I'm wrangling this call this week. Vanessa, who would more typically wrangle our calls, is this week sitting in the chair of our tech wrangler, Becca, who's off. So between us all shifting one seat to the left, we should have this covered, and we're hoping for a smooth hour. This week we are talking about the connection between online and offline communities. 2 weeks ago, in part 1 of our series, we talked about supporting self-directed learners and why scale this at all. This week we're talking about connecting online and offline. And coming up, we have 2 further talks on this, on research questions and better learning analytics. And on the 5th of August, we're talking about asking for help in online learning and where's the need for mentors or coaches. So keep an eye out for those ones to be scheduled. We have 4 panelists joining us today to talk about this. I will let them introduce themselves, and perhaps they could introduce themselves with an answer to our first question and our topic of the day, which is what their experience in connecting online and offline learners is. And we will wrangle this in no particular order other than the order of my screen, which kicks off with Alex.
Well, good afternoon or good morning or evening to everyone. My name is Alex Ruthman, and I'm an associate professor of music education and music technology at NYU. And I guess I came to this this issue of blending online and offline back when I was a middle school music teacher in Michigan, and wanting to create more opportunities for my students to engage with our class materials outside of class because we had such little time for actual face-to-face work in class. And I tended to run my classes in a computer lab where we were making music and composing, and that to me is really where it comes from. It was looking at my students being online and engaged digitally and making music and consuming music, but for me back in that was in the mid-2000s, it was kind of a struggle at the beginning to amalgamate all of these various different tools, trying to find a platform for my students to be able to share their own music, to be able to create and distribute that and collaborate. So we did a bunch of early projects where we paired up with students at other sides of the world in collaborative compositions, and created iTunes playlists where we were sharing each other, and we used wikis for collaborative knowledge bases, and working with that, and all that has led to my most recent project, working in collaboration with Peer University on an massively online music community called Play With Your Music, where we have thousands of people online creating music together, sometimes meeting face-to-face, but again, trying to find ways so that they can connect their own musicianship, their personal musicianship. They're playing together with other people in bands, making music on their own with people, and then trying to use online to basically connect with other like-minded individuals to create, perform, share their music, and work from there. So that's how I come to the table.
Great. Andrew.
Hi, so my name is Andrew Slowinski. I work with the Mozilla Foundation exploring creative tools, which is a role that I'm brand new to. Prior to that, I co-founded and ran product for DIY.org, which is a children's community. And when I think about online and offline spaces, I think a lot about how we design better tools for learning. And I think one of the things that we often do when we design online tools is that we forget about the context, the complete context that a learner is in. And a big part of that is what's happening in their offline world. So are they in a school setting? Are they in a home setting? Are they out in a field somewhere? Are they climbing a tree? What is the actual physical context of the learner? is really important for us to be able to design tools that help facilitate learning specific to that context. So when we talk about online and offline, there's a bunch of different things that I love to talk about. One is the physical context and the affordances and the restraints of that space, but also like who are they with, right? Like, are they with other human beings in that space, if it's a school or if it's at home? So that's part of why I'm so excited to have this discussion, is that it's a part of the broader design landscape that we're working in when we design these spaces, and so I'm really excited and like happy to be talking about it.
Fantastic. Nathan.
Oh, hey, how's it going? Thanks so much for doing this today and helping us organize this, Carl. Yeah, so from my perspective, right now I help lead the community at Khan Academy, and before that I've done so many online, offline learning projects, including alternate reality games to help people learn about the environmental movement, building communities of people who are going to create impact in their local worlds. And what I really think about when it comes to this is that there's a very limited set of real problems for a flexible community to do this. And then if you're in a more set place, like at Khan Academy, where we've helped the flipped classroom idea come to life, it really is about how you enable technology to create a more meaningful in-person experience, which I think is another interesting area we could explore today. So, we think that when you're in person, there's just so much more potential for communication than when you're using technology. And so we thought, why not help people prepare for that in-person learning experience by getting all of the information, first pass the information before they would get to the classroom. And I'm excited to talk more about that.
Excellent. And using host prerogative, I might skip straight over my fellow P2PU, Vanessa, and come back to her. Let's hear from Terry.
Hi, my name is Terry Heick. I'm a former classroom teacher. I'm director at TeachThought, where we're interested in rethinking learning for modern context in light of modern technology. And I guess my experience here started as a classroom teacher. I taught high school English and middle school English, and I was really interested in these emerging new models years ago, project-based learning, scenario-based learning, and place-based education. And those really got me thinking about really broad macro questions like what are people for, and why should we learn, and what should we learn? And so where I started off in education trying to make myself deliver standards more efficiently, I then gravitated towards, well, why should we learn, and using that sort of broad question to inform where we learn in those spaces. So this is a really interesting conversation for me.
Fantastic. And finally, Vanessa, your perspective on the online, offline.
I'm Vanessa. I build learning communities on the web for Peer-to-Peer University. I'm actually probably during this call I'll be asking more questions. This is an area in which everyone else on the call has significantly more experience than I do, but I'm very interested in how online and offline can make each other stickier. I traveled around the world last year, and I talked to a lot of informal tech communities, like Dev Bootcamp and Open Tech School, and those offline communities, their issue is continuity. And so I'm interested in how the online piece can support and bolster a sense of continuity for those offline spaces. We have a lot of P2PU projects coming up. School of the Internet of Things, which will connect makerspaces. We've been working with Mozilla on their WebMaker project, which has a significant offline component. And I'm looking around at other ways that people are using offline spaces to make their online learning stickier. I've worked for the Scratch Ed team at the MIT Media Lab, and those meetups are really effective and powerful. And also, I'm looking at Coursera's connection to Meetup, and so the interplay of offline and online settings in a more adult, informal setting, and what I can learn from all of you.
Great. Well, welcome, and thank you again to all of the panel. Let's dive straight into talking about this, the topic of the day, how we're connecting online and offline and getting the best of both worlds. Let's not pursue a panel where we're going to just go around the table by rote looking for 30-second responses. I'm hoping that we're going to have interesting enough questions from us initially and from the audience going forward that our panel will be scrambling all over themselves to contribute the first and best bon mot. That said, designing to connect online and offline. First question of the day, what are the goals that you're setting when you're trying to design an experience that combines online and offline? And how is that differing for you from the goals when you design a traditional, purely online experience? What changes when you're trying to connect the two? What can you and are you achieving? Who wants to take first crack?
I can try. That's such a huge question. I think like if I channel, so I'm going to go back to two perspectives. One was DIY, and then the other one was actually prior to that. I worked with a lot of after-school programs in the city of Detroit, and one of the things that's like really one of the first pieces that we kind of learned the hard way was how designing these online tools that connect between physical and digital spaces have like a really interesting way in which they relate to users' identities. When we first started with DIY, everyone was anonymous, and they still are. Like we have anonymous nicknames, anonymous avatars, like, and so with that we got all of these great affordances that like the web gives you, where gender doesn't matter anymore, like worldview doesn't matter anymore, like socioeconomic like status doesn't matter anymore. But in the real world, like those things they still exist, and so when you have this like interrelationship, when you kind of start to take the affordances that the web gives that kind of liberates a user from some of those things, allows them to craft a new identity, and then you bring them back into the physical world, there's this interesting thing that happens where all of a sudden they're affronted with real identity again. And that was something that we really struggled with quite a bit. And I think Vanessa just asked me what an affordance is. So an affordance is something that, like, in an interface from like a design perspective, we talk a lot about affordances and restraints. So affordance is something that a particular context gives you, like what's an advantage that it has. What is, to relate it back to the user, what is it something, what does this context or what does this interface allow a user to do? And then a restraint is the opposite of that. What does it inhibit the user to do? And a lot of times we often think about the restraints of physical context very negatively because we love living in this digital free world. But at the same time, like, that's where a lot of learning happens, because when there's, when we talk about like kinesthetic learners, right? That's not, touching a screen is not necessarily the best interface for that. So in those ways, a lot of times when we connect to the physical world, we can actually build deeper learning experiences.
Great. Nathan.
Yeah, no, thanks for queuing it up. I think Andrew's really hit on something, which is when you think about these online offline experiences, there are these like really important design considerations you have to think about first. So I think the main ones I would want to highlight in this discussion is, are you going to have a consistent space, a consistent setting, and a consistent way for people to gather? Like if you think about like a classroom, that's sort of this persistent offline space, which is very different than when you're trying to organize people who don't know each other to find a place to meet. So I think there's these two paradigms in this online-offline learning debate, which is, do you have a space where people will be meeting for a while, or are you trying to create that space over time? Are you trying to allow people to self-organize? And for that first group of people, what we've really seen are important goals to consider are like, how are you going to use that technology? Because they know that they have a place to come together and chat every single time. And so you can use technology either to get them ready for that, or you can use technology during the experience. So one thing that Khan's done that's pretty well known by now is this idea of a flipped classroom. And we have this teacher who we talk about a lot, Peter, who taught at Oakland Unity and helped raise Oakland Unity's students from the 20th percentile to the 99th percentile over a couple of years using Khan Academy. And what he did was he allowed people to really prepare themselves for discussions when they got there, as opposed to using the classroom just as a lecture space. And so that's an example of where the goal in this persistent space was to really use technology to prepare people for the classroom. On the other hand, when you have something where it's much more loose and you have to create connections, I think the most important thing is getting people interested and committed for a set period of time, because before they know how long they're going to try to meet for, it's really hard for them to even find that space. So if it's like 4 people, maybe they can meet in someone's house, but the second it gets to like 8, 12 people, you need to actually have like a secure space, and that can be very hard to secure and cost money. And so that's, I think, is like one of the most important considerations for people who are trying to do online, offline without a space already set.
Excellent. That's really interesting, thinking about whether the offline supports the online or the online supports the offline or both. Vanessa.
Well, I want to build on what Nathan said about creating a consistent space. I think that's a really interesting point. When I've seen at P2PU, we've tried to force it a little bit. We had a project with the Deeper Learning MOOC where we really tried to get people to group, and that turns out to be less successful than something like Learning Creative Learning, where people self-grouped and met up in physical space. So I think the emergent nature and the opt-in nature of it is really important to consider. And along with that, the storytelling bit about the consistent space. I want to tell a story that has worked for Girl Develop It. Are you guys familiar with Girl Develop It? Girl Develop It is a pretty badass crew of chapters where women can go to learn technical skills, and they sign up on Meetup, so there's like a digital locus and a digital anchor there. But in trying to work through and solve the continuity problem, the security problem, and the place problem, in Philadelphia, Girl Develop It, the members they're working on an agreement where the members who go to the Philadelphia chapter of Girl Development actually get a community membership to Indie Hall at the same time. So they're not just signing up for this online experience, they're also being onboarded to a wider and consistent and supportive community. So I think building those infrastructures in a consistent place that Nathan's talking about, I've seen that succeed. Or hopefully it will succeed. Best of luck to Girl Development. We'll see what they do.
Interesting. So Terry, goals of online, offline, and how it differs from goals of a pure online.
Yeah, well, as I'm wont to do, I would usually start this answer by backing up to a broader question, which is, again, if you think of learning in terms of has to be a basic fundamental human need for a skill or some sort of knowledge, and traditionally we have the answer has been these physical spaces, classroom schools. So over the last several hundred years, especially in America the last 100 or so years, we have these schools, and we think of learning as something that happens in a school, education is something that happens in a school. And I think right now with technology, we're thinking of it right now as offline and online, and we think of it as school or blending learning between a school and a website, for example. But I think technology, especially mobile technology, is really, I guess, creating the opportunity to see learning in an entirely different light. And I know that's kind of cliche and that's not really profound, but if you think about if that really happens, if we actually do see learning in an entirely different light, well then a lot of the things that we're struggling with now in terms of measuring mastery, in terms of reporting performance, in terms of analytics, in terms of student motivation, a lot of those things become a lot easier because learning becomes truly cultural. Right now, it's the more academic it is, the more we have to do the carrot on the end of the stick and try to motivate kids to learn. But if learning is more primal and more cultural and more human, a lot of those needs and mechanisms that we struggle with right now kind of go away.
I'm glad you're keeping us honest with the big picture questions. Alex.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with all of that. And if we starting back with the human element, who are our students and where are they? I mean, this has been a theme across this. Is really what happens when we plan our our instruction and our ways of designing when we start with the consideration of the local and where, and whether that's online, and not a dichotomous relationship between online and offline, but it's increasingly blurring, where we might be meeting face to face, but then using our mobile devices to supplement and provide individual access. I'm certainly seeing that a lot in the classrooms that I visit with my students. Is using the mobile devices and the internet in the face-to-face to augment, to allow those personal journeys burrowing into information and coming back and bringing that back to the class. And then how can we then design for those kinds of, being able to get information at the time and then coming back with that. So, I think a lot of it focused, with what we've been trying to do with Play With Your Music, or creating these tools to meet up and to be flexible at different times, and to share our experiences online and offline or in person, wherever we're at.
Just to add on to what Alex was just saying, I think the blurring that Alex is talking about is something that we've noticed, that I've noticed in my own work most certainly, where we started a series of projects that were all based around Minecraft, and then we started to notice that in a lot of the other skills, like when we would say build a campfire or make a log cabin, like kids were submitting like actual log cabins and forest fires that they had built in Minecraft for these physical challenges. And some of them were like trying to game the system, but a lot of them were earnest. Like when we said, no, you actually need to build a real campfire, like there was like this shock. It was just like, oh, what? I don't understand the difference. Like, this took work. Why is this any different? And so I think, like, we come to this discussion and to this process with a bias of understanding a dichotomy between the physical and the digital. And I think we also come to it with understanding a dichotomy to kind of further what Terry was saying, between what we understand as a space for learning and just space more general, like the space that we occupy as human beings. And I think, like, when Terry is talking about making learning part of culture and bringing it back to the human level, which is where it should be. There's another piece that we can talk about too, which is like if we're talking about consistent spaces, like the way that we understand consistent spaces as educators is, quite frankly, I think its days are kind of numbered. Like, if we want to bring learning to where the people are, then we need to talk about what the things that we're building are empowering learners to do regardless of the space that they're in. And I think, like, unfortunately the word online has a connotation to the web, which has a connotation to the desktop. And that's unfortunately it's not true. Like, that's not what really needs to happen. Like, there's a connection to mobile, there's a connection to ubiquitous computing. And if we think about how the things that we build fit into that context, that's not that far away. That it's already here now, and it's just growing. What does that look like, and how does that change? How can we empower users to make their own learning spaces, not the ones that we dictate?
So that's some great stuff, and some very interesting points, particularly around the culture and the creation of spaces and identity across the boundary. I'm going to start interweaving some questions that are coming up from our audience, because they flow on from some of this really nicely. First, quick question, picking up where you left off, Andrew, or anyone else who wants to answer it, is this question of mobile and ubiquitous computing. How is mobile adding to this or differentiating from traditional online? Is it just a new portal into online, or does it sit in between, or is it something, an entirely new layer?
Well, I think for me, mobile in particular has like, yeah, thanks for the softball question, Carl.
I haven't heard where this is going.
Well, I think, like, for me, like, obviously I'm ridiculously biased when it comes to this. I mean, I work on mobile tools for kids, but the reason why I care about this stuff, the reason why I think about it is there's a couple different things. One is that when we think about desktop computing or even laptop computing, it has a natural bias built into it, because we're built into this tool where we're staring at this window. It comes with the cultural baggage and the cultural connotation of STEM. And so I think with that, there's been a natural sort of connection between online learning tools and traditional, what we talk, at least in the United States, that we talk about as STEM education. And one of the things that I'm excited about with mobile is that we can break that connotation up a little bit. Is that if a kid is in a field, or if a learner is out in the woods, or if they are, doing anything, building rockets, you name it, is that there's this portal, there's this device that can help facilitate learning. There's this device that can help facilitate distributed knowledge, that can be broken of that sort of strong tie specifically to STEM and help facilitate knowledge regardless of where it is. And the other one is that they're cheaper. And that's a big deal. There's a huge gap, like both within the United States, but also I'd say like globally, that creates a barrier between what we traditionally have thought about as online teaching tools, a laptop, a desktop computer, and what a $25 phone can do. And that to me is like the other part of this that's incredibly empowering.
I thought you handled that question fine. Do others want to chime in on the mobile question?
Yeah,
context of learning online and offline.
Sorry, I'd love to chime in on it. I think it's totally a fascinating question to think about. Suddenly, we no longer have to worry about the constraints of a room or a space or whatever, and you can really be looking at whatever you're trying to learn in a more close context. So if you want to be learning about biology, you can be looking at grass and using the mobile phone as something to, take that further in an outdoor setting. I think what's really interesting and exciting is that mobile is starting to figure out some of these things when it comes to personalized learning. Like if I want to use my mobile tool to help me look something up, to help me scan something, to help me kind of get more context on that information that I'm looking at with my actual eyes or my actual ears or smelling it. But then there's a huge unanswered question, I think, around how is any of that enabled by as a social experience. So if you think about people who tried to go out and say, hey, let's do this class activity where you're using your mobile phone and it's like this augmented reality device. There's just a bunch of kids out there on their own with like holding up phones, and it's not necessarily using social or using people together. And so I think that it's fascinating because at the same time, mobile devices are inherently more social. You can call someone, you can text someone, you can tweet at somebody. There's just more ways for you to connect easily. And so I think that there's a huge potential there. Although I wonder what everyone else thinks, I do think it is still a little ways down the road for us to have sort of technology and connectivity where we need it to be for all of that to be enabled.
Alex, your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think we're seeing also some interesting experiments moving from mobile to the Internet of Things and tangible. And the stories that I have related to that is work I've been doing with the Makey Makey kits and kids in designing and building their own musical instruments. It's not just and extending this social. It's also enabled moving from this one-to-one, mouse to computer to multi-touch, and then multiple students with multiple devices, and then embedding sensors and very easily in other items. So whether we're taking a cup and using conductive string or conductive tape, or and building a virtual guitar that's then people play together in bands, or we're using conductive ink printed onto 3D objects that we then touch and interact with. It's opening up all sorts of new possibilities where before we might have just had this kind of one-to-one relationship. Now we can reclaim with the technology. The technology can be a co-partner with us in the expression of music and in the learning process.
So there's a follow-on question from this coming from Terry, which is how does or should the technology work to support groups that are already in the same space, by which I assume he means physical space? Do people have comments about that? Another way of asking this question is a question that's on my mind, which is, should all learning be blended? Should all learning have both offline and online components? Is there a role for purely online? Is there a role for purely offline? Which one supports the other?
Yeah, I'm not sure if blended is the right word, but I think that I think it'll have to, right? Like to my point, like early on in the discussion, I don't think that it's a false dichotomy to try to split the two. Even digital learning happens in a physical context, and the digital is so ubiquitous at this point that there's no way to split it from our physical realities. And so I don't think that I think it's trying to set up a false dichotomy to try to think that there's going to be a difference. Like, as you know, Terry and Alex were kind of alluding to, and there's like this awesome side channel chat going on, is that like learning will happen anywhere that humans are, and like, so if there's humans and there's technology, you're always going to have this kind of mix between the two. And I think what's important to remember is that we should design for that context rather than trying to set up this false split that exists.
Vanessa?
Well, I'm trying to stay quiet. I'm trying to stay quiet because I'm like, I want to learn from all the awesome folks, but I have more questions. So, Alex, I know that you're running this camp over the summer for girls making music. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you designed that informal learning experience for the web to open up the classroom, for the web to these tools that learners are going to use to take it beyond the walls of the classroom, and how you design for that. And I am very interested also in the politics, and I mentioned this in our pre-call. There are several educators out there who are worried about the opening up the walls of the classroom in a networked way because they're concerned about mucking up the privacy and the trust of this small subculture that's been built. So they see opening up the classroom in a networked way as a threat. So, Alex, how have you designed for this? And also, what would you say to someone who is very interested, is very concerned about, the 20-person seminar classroom and not wanting to make someone feel vulnerable on the web and break that culture that's been built?
Sure. Well, I think the project first you're talking about is our Girls Electronic Music Seminar, which we run for middle school girls in New York City with my colleague Agnieszka Roginska in our music tech program, and that was focused on very open. A lot of we used Makey Makey, we used Scratch in having the girls assemble and curate materials to build their own musical instruments. They've worked a lot with musical gameplay and an interactive, actually an interactive twister board and whole gameplay kind of around that. But it was, I think, what you're referring to with the use of the online was we used a new tool, a new platform that was developed by Tiffany Tseng at the MIT Media Lab called Build in Progress, which is like a version of Instructables.com, but rather than enforcing a very, linear pathway through steps and build stages, it gives you a tool to actually document your building process and all the messiness and divergent and dead ends that you run across with that. And so that became a big part of the design thing, is providing them a tool both mobile and as an Android app where they could photo and take recordings and video of what they were making, and then easily have that up and then be able to use that as a reflective tool from moment to moment or day to day, documenting how the decisions they made and what worked and what didn't work. So I think that that was it was very fascinating to us to see how they, and we're still deploying it and betaing it and seeing how it will work. But it's fascinating to watch the girls to see what they document and how they reflect. Just providing that tool and that structure for them to build to document their thinking and then their reflective thinking and pull that together. As far as the politics go, I think it's something you have to be mindful of your local context and to what extent you feel comfortable rocking the boat. I haven't run into many political barriers myself, and I have with licensing and music and things like that, and how to balance those rights. But overall, it's about, and this is what I think is a nice thing about some of these spaces, is that a lot of the stuff that I would do with kids, we really had to take into account privacy and things like that. So even just thinking about when I look at the online communities, it's an opportunity for people to connect outside of class. It's an opportunity for them to, take the time outside of class to think and then put their sharing back. So even within it, if we think about our face-to-face classrooms, not necessarily as classrooms, but as communities, we can take some of the things that we've learned from offline and bring that into the face-to-face.
And for the record, there's a lot of enthusiastic support for the Makey Makey project in the sidebar chat that we have here on the Hangout for those who aren't part of the panel. So yeah, we love that example that Alex is involved with. There's a follow-on question on this politics and practicalities issue coming from the audience, which is the role of parents, guardians, and mentors in all of this, dealing with them, supporting with them. Obviously, an educator's role often involves educating them as much as the immediate learners. Do we have tips, tricks, or comments from the panel on interacting with parents, guardians, and mentors in this context?
That's such an important question. So I think at DIY, but also I think more broadly, this was something that I spent a lot of time exploring. And in fact, I would say it was probably the biggest thing that we spent time exploring was how do we keep kids safe and then also give them this incredibly liberating learning experience. There was this tension, and I think what we found, and at least where I've come to be with it at this point, is that it was it was this kind of false connection that we created, where we absolutely needed to keep kids safe and we absolutely needed to protect identities, and we needed to do all of the right things in terms of COPPA and kind of all these pieces. But we sort of looked at it as this barrier. It was in the way of creating this incredible liberating experience. And what we sort of started to find is that specific to the parent and teacher question was that the most important thing that we could do, COPPA, which is the Children's Online Privacy and Protection Act, mandated that we had an adult in the room, right? That we had an adult as a participant to this digital learning experience. And what we found through the data, through the learning analytics, was that actually it's better to have adults involved in all of this, period. That creating these digital tools without understanding part of the physical context is that there are adults that exist and in these worlds, in these spaces, oftentimes connected to their kids. And so what we started to think about was not as COPPA as this barrier to building this learning environment, but that COPPA was just one set of rules that sort of connected to how we got an adult involved with a very specific set of our users. And I think that's kind of colored everything for me in terms of how I think about parents and teachers and their relationship to these digital learning communities, because I think that it's such an important part of building great learning experiences is that involvement, is when the user experience falls apart, having another human there to help pick you up is an incredibly powerful thing, and we should design for that.
Nathan.
Yeah, I'd love to build on that. I think at Khan Academy we spend a lot of time looking at outside of the pedagogy and curriculum and all this stuff that really is about learning content and how it's going to be, the instruction is given. There's this whole world of other factors that really enable people to succeed. And those are, in some ways, the most critical factors. Do you feel like you belong to this group of people? And sometimes, if you have we work with young kids too, and sometimes they aren't the best at creating that sense of community. And so having an adult there is actually an extremely critical part to making that work. And then also, once people feel like they belong, it actually allows for a lot of great stuff to happen for them, feeling like they can learn. And so there is this huge power of having adults involved, and we struggle too with some of the COPPA Act, and it'd be interesting to think about how to turn that into an opportunity. So thanks for bringing that up, Andrew.
And Alex, you had an example of this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm thrilled this came up because it's so easy to focus on learners and students without realizing that we're part of a larger unit, and it made me think about the classic music pedagogy of Shinichi Suzuki, who explicitly talks about having the parents there learning the violin and the other musical instruments together with the children. And I think we don't do enough to connect parents as co-learners, as co-teachers with our students, and there are a lot of models, but again, that was undergird, that was about building stronger families, and which is another broader human goal, perhaps that we might want to think about when we're having these conversations about why we're learning and why we're focusing on that. It's not just about the individual, but the collective, the humans that we are living with and around every day.
I want to move to a slightly related question, which has come from the audience, which is, in this context of connecting the online and the offline learning experiences, what's the role of anonymity, or what's the fate of anonymity? Does it continue to play a role? Can it be made to play a role? Is it a roadblock? Who wants to speak to that?
I can jump in on that if that's okay. Yeah, I mean, again, from different experiences I've had at IDEO and at Khan Academy, it's really important to think about what role it does play. There's so much power in being able, especially if you're learning, what you're doing is you're reinventing, you're changing the way your brain works, and you're actually making different parts of your brain have stronger connections and using the plasticity in it to really create new experiences. And so it's important to have that flexibility. It's great when you can sort of recreate yourself and be someone you're not, and actually try out different things that help you create those new connections in your brain you might not have. But with that said, there is the big caution that when there is anonymous discussions, especially online, we all know the sort of famous rule of blogging that comments sink to the lowest common denominator. And so that's an extremely important thing to figure out how to prevent. So what we do at Khan Academy is we think a lot about moderation tools, and then allowing our community to really lead that moderation. So that protects against it, because we do think that there is something very powerful about when you're learning to not have to necessarily stick to being the same person all the time, or it's not being able to sort of veer from who you say you are the first time you show up in a community, or what your bio might read.
Alex.
Yeah, and for me, this goes back to my experience as a middle school teacher and thinking about anonymity in adolescents, and particularly for adolescent users, the experience and story that I have comes from looking at the Noteflight.com forums, which Noteflight is an online social music notation software program where people can create guitars and themselves. It's interesting because the forums are actually majority made up of teens under 17, and in that space particularly, there's a lot of anonymous conversation that happens, but it allows the students to take on different personas and express who they are in a safe space without being exposed. So in that sense, the ability to be able to share something that's very personal, like a song that you've written, or a musical composition that is expressing a deep emotion, being able to share that in an anonymous way with another peer group and get feedback and be able to test out different identities has been really helpful in that community to make that grow. And particularly with Noteflight, they made a deliberate decision not to allow private messaging, again for COPPA and for bullying and things like this, but instead all messaging is public. So that you can have moderation if there are things with that, and as a result, they run. There's these side conversations of teens talking about, no, I have to, I'd like to converse with you on Twitter or on Facebook, but no, I need to protect my identity, and it actually raises the interesting conversation. So that's a fascinating place to look at anonymity, which is actually seems to be helping the adolescents who are involved in expressing and sharing their music.
Noteflight, okay. Terry.
Yeah, I think there's this tempting belief that online allows people with these natural interests to be free and express themselves and connect with other people that are extremely supportive. And I think that's very possible, but I also think that there's this the possibility of intense peer pressure and status quo and conforming to essentially, if you're online, you want some sort of visibility usually. When you're interacting, you want visibility. And often the best ways to get that visibility is to blend in with the people around you, and especially for adolescent learners. When you think about digital citizenship and digital footprints, and everything you do and say leaves some sort of mark, and can be shared and screenshotted and mocked and ridiculed. I think that's important to consider, that if you're anonymous, you probably are, students anyway, especially students that are still developing their own identity, they may feel empowered to do things that they may not have done in the past, because they're not constantly having to maintain that image and that identity that I'm this. I feel that as a writer or a blogger or a speaker. I often have opinions that I know won't be very popular, and sometimes I'm willing to share those, but sometimes I just wish I had a separate website or a separate blog or a separate Twitter feed where I could say certain things, because I realize that there's a certain image and identity, and you have to maintain that, because the whole reason you're sharing it online is because you want some sort of traction, and so that's a challenge. Andrew?
So I'm glad that this question came in from the audience, because I think it's one of the biggest. It's not answerable by any of us, and that's that the history for how anonymity and digital identities is going to go down is very much so like in play right now between a bunch of giant organizations, the government, and us. Most importantly, us. And I think that, you know, what Terry is kind of getting to, and that like we're kind of talking around, is about user choice, right? Is about today there is a limited sort of ability for users to decide that they want to be anonymous online. And so like when we connect it back to the physical context, is like we have faces, we have names, we have voices, like we have the attributes of human beings that sort of prevent that, like when we're in a physical space. When we're, and this kind of gets back to, I think I talked about this at the very first question, was that there's a connection between anonymity and sort of liberty, like the ability for a learner to assume an identity that's other than their own, that isn't stifled by gender, politics, you know, socioeconomic status, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's some power in that. But I think like at the end of the day, there are trade-offs that happen between these two sides. And I would actually, I would argue against the anonymity always leads us down to the lowest common denominator. At DIY, users are all anonymous, and we don't have a massive trolling problem. We don't have a massive trolling problem because we modeled great community behaviors, we incentivize for great community behaviors, and we build moderation tools that help us prevent against that. I think talking about anonymity having the inevitability of everyone acting horribly to each other online is a myth that we should try to dispel, or at least a myth that I think is worthy of fighting against a little bit, because I don't think that the evidence is conclusive there yet.
And Nathan?
I raised my hand about something you said earlier. Does anyone want to respond to that point before I jump to something else?
I think it's all yours.
Okay, yeah, the one thing I thought was really important to bring up in this discussion of anonymity and online versus offline is offline. There's a lot of regulations about when you can be recorded. So when you talk offline, there is an expectation that it's not persistent, it's not something that can go elsewhere, and the ways you can use it, like at least in court, I mean, it can go viral online and be a problem, but at least like legally speaking, you have a lot of protection there. Whereas online, the paradigm's actually pretty different. It's almost that anything that you've written can go anywhere very quickly and it will persist forever. And so I think that's like a very important thing, and why when you're learning and when you're younger, and it's really important for there to be this place where you don't have to be verified as yourself online, so you can take a bit more risks and not feel like it might haunt you for the next 100 years.
It's a very good point. It's one of those places they do still differ, isn't it? I want to move on and ask the failure question now. for anyone brave enough to talk about the specific stories of things that you've learned in designing these online and offline learning experiences that include elements of both. What have you learnt the hard way? What hasn't worked? What have you only got right in successful times, in successive iterations, I should say? Or what are you still trying to get right? Terry.
Yeah, so I work with, I don't like to use the word homeschool, but because that has awful connotations, I think, for me. But I have a 14-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old son and a 7-year-old son, and I teach them. And so we use something called combination learning, which is some harebrained scheme I have that really it boils down to I just look at the ingredients of learning, what's necessary for learning. And so, in an outcomes-based learning environment as a teacher, my experience as a teacher is I'm given a set of standards and a curriculum map and a pacing guide and a scope and sequence. And then from all of that, I plan units and lessons and assessments. And then based on those assessment results, I make some sort of modification and revisions. But everything is entirely dictated by those standards. Everything is completely consumed by those standards. And so then I thought, well, what are the necessary ingredients for learning? So I think I've got like 12 categories now. I've pared it down from 18. I'm at 12 now. But this idea of space, collaboration, emotion, curiosity, digital tools, reasons to learn, learning models, learning strategies, thinking strategies, fundamental notions of literacy. I take all this stuff, and then I put it together in different combinations. So, for example, my daughter the other day was doing something on the ocean, and her combination was the ocean, John Lennon, and a video blog on her YouTube channel. And so it's up to her to take those three ingredients and create something that's sort of meaningful to her. Now that's just one crazy sort of example, but the idea was I'm experimenting with and continuing to experiment with these ingredients so that my students, my children, can also feel empowered to make those same sort of combinations. And what I've learned, the failure has come with, I just assumed that there would be a natural curiosity that they would bring to the table. Because as a teacher, one of the things I really noticed that was missing was curiosity in my students. Sometimes we call it engagement, or we call it, whatever name we use. The students didn't come to school and say, "Oh, I really want to understand this." They say, "What do we have to do today? What are we going to do today?" But this idea that this thirst for knowledge wasn't there. So I assumed that if I put these combinations together right, my kids would just take off and I wouldn't be able to shut them up. And I'm realizing that so much of learning is psychological. There's a deep psychology behind learning. What motivates us, and why do we want and need to understand things? So curiosity wasn't necessarily being stifled by these standards that I was haunted by as a classroom teacher, even though I think they were a problem. That wasn't entirely the problem, because I completely broke that tether and set my kids down in front of the most amazing tools and circumstances and spaces ever, and they still sat there. And I thought maybe they were paralyzed by choice, but they would just sit there and drool and say, "What do you want me to do?" And I thought it was my worst nightmare. I thought, no, if I give you access to these communities and these problems and these models, you're just going to soar and you're going to take off and it's going to be amazing. And it really didn't happen, and it was really humbling. And I'm continuing to work really hard on a daily basis to try to figure out what's missing. And the answer, the resting point I'm at right now is the psychology of learning. I know it's something about human psychology, and I'm not exactly, and that's something that public education takes completely off the table. It doesn't matter if you're curious. It doesn't matter if you want to. It doesn't matter if you're interested. None of that matters. This is the standard. This is the target. This is the test. You either do it or you don't. All of that is completely off the table. And when you're opening up spaces and you're creating opportunity, well, suddenly all that psychology does matter.
Thanks, Terry. It's a great example of that classic engagement problem that we all face in designing the online communities, right? And someone in the audience has raised earlier in the session the very good point that when we're talking about combining online and offline, you encounter this problem going the other way as well, where you have online communities that then create their offline meetups, getting them to sizzle and create engagements, even face-to-face, faces all those same kind of engagement problems. So it's not a problem that's unique to the fact that people are faceless and meeting online. It's something else in the psychology of the engagement. We have a series of others who want to speak to this question. Nathan, go for it.
Oh, yeah, so my experience actually is very relevant for that, which is at my last job at IDEO, we had this online community of people who were going out and trying to create basically social impact in the world, and we would try and connect them together in groups and form communities that would go out and do something in their community based on some big question where they could explore it and define their own sort of goal. And the big thing that was really hard to make happen was it was really hard to make these groups persist. It's this idea that, like, you want to sort of make a project easy, but learning isn't easy. Like, a project is not going to be easy, and you're going to have to struggle a lot. And for people who don't know each other well, who aren't friends, who haven't worked together, it's really hard to get them to come back together over and over and over again. And so we kind of struggled basically to, the main issues we had was we'd start having a great group of people who were gelling offline, and they could talk online and work offline together. And we started seeing that whenever new people came to those meetings, they were open meetings, the new versus old dynamic would really throw a wrench into the whole system. And so how you introduce new people into these groups is just, I think, completely critical, and something that anyone who wants to go out there and think about bringing online and offline experiences together really needs to have some way for membership to not just be so fluid that people can come and interrupt other people's progress as they're coming back for the third or fourth week of a meeting. So that was a big learning for us, and something that I still think I would love to learn how other people are addressing.
Andrew.
So I think one interesting thing about this question is, like, when you think about the early days of the web was initially created to connect physical communities to each other. And as the web has evolved, and as, like, our understanding of these tools has evolved, and, like, what has happened is that virtual communities are now going in the other way. Like, they're actually starting to be physical manifestations of virtual communities. Like, we see that in hacker spaces, we see that in conferences, we see that in some of these co-working spaces. Like, that's a really interesting emergent phenomenon. And, like, I think that was one of the things that we learned, going back to learning things the hard way, that was one of the things that we learned the hard way at DIY for sure, was once kids sort of got to this point of, like, having a really great connection with another kid around a shared subject, is that, like, they wanted to take the next step. Like, they wanted to go make something together, which is a really wonderful thing. And then all of a sudden, all the privacy issues and all of these, safety issues and all of these other things came up. And so we decided to try to do this idea of maker clubs, which wasn't particularly successful for us. And I think one of the reasons why it wasn't is that we thought about them as separately. It was like, well, we have this great online community of kids who love learning. Let's just allow them to create these physical spaces as well, and then we'll sort out the mess later. And I think, like, to Nathan's point, and I know that I've talked to Vanessa about this as well, is building physical spaces and building virtual spaces where people feel empowered, where they feel like they have shared understanding, where they feel kinship, where they feel belonging, like where they feel all of these things that enable or help facilitate really great learning. Even though the demands are the same on physical spaces, like the manifestations of how you solve those things are very, very different. And I think that kind of gets back to some of Terry's thoughts as well, about creating these physical spaces can be really, really difficult, and it takes practice.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm conscious it's now 12:58. Unfortunately, we are coming to that point where we need to start wrapping things up. I am very conscious that we have a whole load of interesting comments that have come through, both within the panel and in the Unhangout from those watching there. We haven't had time to talk about all of them, unfortunately, but following this panel, we will be wrapping up a lot of this and addressing some of them on our site at p2pu.org. There will be either a blog post or certainly some of these open questions I will put to the forum and make sure they go up on put to our panel and make sure they go up on our forums at community.p2pu.org. So please all do join the conversation there. If you have other questions that you want to ask that haven't been answered, please jump on there and ask them, and we will hold our panel accountable to get you some answers on what we can. Coming up after this talk, I would remind you that in 2 weeks' time we will have part 3 of our series of talks on scale and online learning. On the 29th of July, we'll be talking about the issue of research questions and learning analytics and how they fit into scale and online learning. And many of the same panelists here today will be back then. So please join us then. You will see announcements about that from us in due course. And in the meantime, I would say a big thank you to all of our panel today. I think it's been a fantastic conversation. I'm going to sit quietly and digest much of it for another hour or two now. Vanessa is making her trademarked heart meet sign, which means that she thinks it's gone well, which is always good. Thank you all. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for speaking, and thank you for your questions. If no one has any further comments, I think we will end the broadcast here.